Alright then gang, so in this extra chapter I just wanted to add a few JavaScript hints and extra tutorials to help you along with this course. So nothing in this chapter is going to be to do with Vue, but we'll just cover some of the JavaScript constructs that we use along the way so that you can refer to them when you need to. So things like array methods such as map and filter, spread syntax, template strings, promises and async and await, and much more as well. Also, if you do want to learn about any web-based technologies, I've got over 1,000 free tutorials on everything from JavaScript to Flutter to Node on my YouTube channel, The Net Ninja. So I'm going to leave that link attached to this lecture so that you can check them out as well whenever you want. So the first thing I want to talk about is imports and exports in JavaScript. Now imports and exports are a feature of modern JavaScript specifications, ES6, and we can use imports and exports in all kinds of modern websites. So what these allow us to do is export certain values from a file and import them into another file to be used there. So I've got a ninjas.js file with 3 different values, a ninjas array, format ninjas, which is a function, and greet, which is a function. Now it doesn't matter what these functions do, that's not the point. I've just created some content so that we can export it. And imagine now I wanted to export these things so I could import them over here. Well, what would we do? Typically we'd say export an object like so, and then inside this object say what properties we want to export, or what values rather. So say for example I want to export ninjas. I would just say in here export ninjas inside this object. So I'm going to save that, and now if I wanted to I could import this thing in the other file. I could say import, then we import the object, and inside that the different properties we want to import. Well, we want to import ninjas, and we say where it's from by saying from and then a string which is a path to the other file. So ./ninjas.js. Okay? And now if I wanted to, I could use that value ninjas inside this file. So what I've done is created an index file so we can preview this in a browser, and I'm linking to the index.js file right here, not the ninjas one, just the index one. And also we have this type equals module, and we have to put that in when we're previewing this in a browser, otherwise this module system right here won't work where we're exporting and importing. So what I'm going to do now is right click this and open it up in a live server so we can preview. And I'm just going to open up the console over here, and we can see this array with all of these different names. So that's worked. Now what we're doing is we're viewing all of these ninjas from the index file, and we can do that because we imported it. So what if we want to export several different values? Well, we can do that by comma separating them. So I can export all of these things, format ninjas and greet included. And now we could grab any of those from here. So if I wanted to just get one of them, for example greet, I could. And then down here I could just call that function like so. And again, this would work. And if I bring the browser back open, we can see Sean says hello. That's the greet function working. Okay? Now there is another type of export I want to show you, and that is the default export. So sometimes you'll see this, export default and then some kind of value. And all that means is, look, this is the default export from this value. And we can import default values from another file as well. I'll show you how to do that. So imagine now, I don't want ninjas to be inside this object we export, but instead I want it to be the default export of this file. What that means is that from another file, I'm not going to import it right here. I want to import the default value. And to do that, we say import, and then whatever you want to call this, I'm going to call it ninjas, since that's what we're importing, from ./ninjas.js. So if I save this now, this is still going to work because this is a default import. Notice this time we don't put this inside curly braces because we're not importing an object, only the default value, which is not exporting an object, just the value itself. So let me bring the browser back over and we can see this still works. All right. Now, the good thing about a default import is that we can call this whatever we want inside this file. I can call it ABC if I wanted to, and then use ABC down here. And this will still work. And I'm going to show you that by bringing this back over. It still works right here. Okay. And the reason this works is that we're importing a default value. And when we do that, we can call this anything we want. It still imports that ninjas value, but within the scope of this file, we're calling it ABC. We can't do that inside here. I couldn't say ABC because it's not going to know what to import because there's many things that we export. But when it's a default thing, we only have one default export. We can't have this twice, for example, like this, and export default format ninjas as well. We can't do that because there's now two default exports. We can only ever have one, and so we can call it whatever we want because it knows there's only one default export and to call that thing ABC. Okay? So that's pretty much it as far as imports and exports are concerned. Again, we could go deeper into this if we wanted to and get really technical, but I don't want to, and I think that will be enough to help you out throughout this course whenever we use imports and exports. So throughout this course, we'll be using a lot of arrays of data. Now, the data inside those arrays could be blog posts, they could be users, they could be playlists, any kind of data, it doesn't really matter. The fact is, we're going to use them a lot, and I'm going to be using several array methods in order to manipulate this data as well. Two of the array methods that I'm going to be using a lot are the filter method, which we would use to filter out items from the array, and the map method, which takes an array and maps it into a different kind of array. So we're going to see examples of both of these. So first of all, the filter method. We'd use the filter method if we want to take an array of data and we want to filter certain items out of it. For example, in this case, we have an array of objects where each object is a ninja. They have a name property and a belt color. Now imagine we want to get a new array based on this one, whereby we contain objects that only have a belt value of black. So this one and this one. In essence, what we want to do is filter this and this out of the array. Now, the filter method and the map method is non-destructive, and that means that we don't actually alter the original data array in itself. All we do is return a new array based on the original, and that's important because a lot of the time you don't want to mutate your original data. Just manipulate it and get other data from it. So let's try the filter method. I'm going to say const, and we'll call this black belts, and this will eventually hold the new filtered array. And we set it equal to ninjas, which is the original array right here, and then use the filter method. Now, the filter method fires a function for each item in the ninjas array. So this one, then this one, and then this one, and then this one. And that function we declare right here. So I'm going to pass it in. It's an arrow function right here. So this function is going to fire for this first, then this, and then this. And every time we fire the function, we get access to the individual item it's currently on. Now, we take that as an argument inside this function. You can call it item, or you can call it whatever you want. I'm going to call it ninja because that's singular of ninjas. So in here, we could just do something like console.log ninja, and that's going to log this, then this, then this, then this to the console. I'll demo that. Look at the console, and we see each of these log to the console. Now, ultimately, we don't want to do this. We want to do something inside this function for each item. Now, if we return true for the item, it remains in the array, and this is the new array that we'll have right here. If it returns false, then it will be filtered out of the array, and it won't be in this new array right here. So if I just return false for every single item, for every single ninja, then this array will be empty. And I can demo that. Console.log, and it's going to be black belts. Save that, and we can see an empty array. If I return true, then it's going to be an array exactly the same as this one right here, because we're saying to every item in that array, return true. That means we keep it inside the new array. Save it, and we can see it's exactly the same. So we want to dynamically return either true or false, dependent on something to do with that individual ninja, that item. So what I want to do is return true if the belt is black, and false if it's not. So what I can say is return, and then ninja, which is our object, dot belt is equal to black. So this is a statement right here that is going to be evaluated. And it's either going to be true or false, isn't it? Does the ninja, the individual item we're iterating, belt color equal black? The first time around, that's going to be true. So we return true, and it keeps it in the array. The second time around, it's going to be false, so we return false. It takes it out of the array, it filters it out. The third time black, so it keeps it in. The fourth time green, so it filters it out. And then we end up with an array right here of two items. So we can see that, and they both contain the belt black. Now, like I said, it's important to note that the original array, ninjas, is not altered. We can still output that, and we can see the second array right here. We've not changed it. All we've done is used it to create a filtered array, which is now stored in black belts. So that's the filter method. Okay, let's move on to the map method. So the map method does something similar. It fires a function for each item inside the array, and it returns a new value based on that. So say, for example, we want a new array, and I'm going to call this strings, or rather we'll call it names. And say we want this to be an array of just the ninja names. So Sean, Mario, Yoshi, and Luigi. We don't care about the belt, and we don't want objects. We just want strings. So what we could do is take the ninjas array, use the map method on it, and then inside here, again, we fire a function for each individual item inside the array. Again, I'm going to call that ninja, but you can call it what you want. And then we return a value right here. And whatever value we return is going to be allotted to the array names for that position. So say, for example, I return a number 1. Then it means we're going to have an array right here, which is 1, 1, 1, 1. Because for every single function that's fired, for every item in this array, we're returning 1. And that item or that value is added to the array right here each time. If I save it, we can see. No, we can't. Let me just log them to the console. Console.log and then names. Save it. And now we can see 1, 1, 1, 1. Now what we want to do here is return instead the name of the ninja. So I can return ninja.name like so. And now we're going to get an array of just the names, okay, which is stored inside this. So that's the map method as well. And again, very important to note that this does not alter the original array. All it does is create a new array names based on the original. It doesn't mutate the original data. So we can see down here, we still have all of the ninjas inside here. So that is the filter and the map method. And both of these we'll be using quite frequently in our different Vue components to manipulate data. So I just want to take a couple of minutes to talk about something called spread syntax. And what this allows us to do is spread the contents of data out into new structures. Now that might seem a little bit weird at first, but it does have its uses, and we'll see this fairly frequently throughout this course. So look at this first example. We have a ninjas array, which is 3 strings. Now if I log that to the console, we're going to see an array, right, of 3 items like this. Now what if I do ... ninjas? Well, this is spread syntax, and what it means is take each one of these out and spread them. So now we'll just get 3 separate strings, but not an array of 3 separate strings like this. And that's what the spread syntax does. Now we can do something similar with objects, and this is where it becomes a little more useful. So I'm going to comment this out. And imagine we have this object that comes back from some API or something like that in JSON format. We pass it into an object, and what we want to do is maybe not alter the original object, but we want to create a new object based on this, which also has an ID property. Well, we could do something like this. We could say const and then do ID blog and set that equal to an object, right? Now what we want to do is take all of the properties of this object, so we could say ... blog, and what that does is spread out all of these properties and values into this new object, and then we can add further properties onto this object, like an ID, for example, and that would create us a new object based on the old one with all of the original items or properties from that original object and a new property as well. So that's why this spread syntax is quite good, because we'll be doing this kind of thing later on when we work with data coming from our database. I'm going to just log this to the console so you can see it, and it's called ID blog. Save that, and if we view this, now we can see we get this object with the 2 original properties, author and title, but also an ID as well. So just something to bear in mind. It's quite simple, but we will be using this quite a lot. Alright, so now let's talk about template strings. Now template strings are a special type of string in JavaScript that allow us to embed variables into them. So imagine I want a string like this. Hi, my name is, and then I have to concatenate this thing right here, name. This is how we'd normally do it, with a plus symbol, and then plus again, and then another string to say, and I am a, and then another concatenation, job. So what this would do is create a string that says, hi, my name is Sean and I am a developer. So this is the normal way we would add variables into a string using this concatenation, but it can be quite messy. So instead, we can use what's known as a template string. Now I'm going to store this in a constant and I'll just call it string. It doesn't really matter what it's called. And I'm going to use backticks instead of single quotes or double quotes. Now backticks on my keyboard are just underneath the escape key. And they look something like this. So a bit like single quotes, but angled to the left. Now inside here, we can output variables. So I could say, hi, my name is, and then instead of breaking out of the template string over here again and using a plus sign to add in the variable, we can do that directly inside the template string itself. Now we can't just use the name of the variable like this because then it thinks it's literally the word name, and we don't want to do that. We want to output a variable. So the way we do that is by saying $ and curly braces and then the name variable right here. So that's how we output a variable inside the template string. And I can carry on now, and my job is a, and then output the other one. So job, oops, inside curly braces, like so. Now if I log this to the console, we'll see the whole string. So it's called string like so. Save it and preview, and we can see, hi, my name is Sean and my job is a developer. So again, we'll be using this kind of thing fairly frequently throughout this course. So now I just want to take a quick minute to talk about arrow function syntax. Now, arrow functions are a new type of functions in JavaScript. They were released with ES6, and typically most modern web applications use them. So I just want to quickly give you an overview of this. I don't want to delve too deep into them because it's a big topic and potentially I could talk about it for about half an hour. I don't want to do that. I just want to show you the syntax so that you're not confused when you see this inside the course projects that we create. So this is how we create an original function, right? We say the function keyword, the name of the function, parentheses, curly braces, and then the code inside the function. What if I was to create an arrow function instead? What would that look like? Well, first of all, we could store it in a variable. So I could say const and then the name of the function, which I could call greet2, and then we set it equal to the function. And this time we don't use the function keyword, we just use the parentheses, which are the same thing as these, and then we use what's known as arrow syntax. So equals and then a angle bracket. And then we use our curly braces and we can do whatever we want inside the function. So console.log hello again. Okay, so they look fairly similar, but this one right here is stored in a constant. This is the function name, and then we set it equal to the function. Now, a lot of the times you'll see this kind of syntax inside other functions that take in a callback function as an argument. For example, the map method. So say we have some kind of array called names. We don't, but imagine we do. And I want to map through them. Then inside here, we could pass in a function. Now, a long time ago, we might have said function like this, and then created some code inside. Now we don't have to do that. We can use the arrow function, which is just this syntax. We don't have to use the name or anything like that. We just use this bit right here. So we can say that arrow and then the curly braces. And then we take in any arguments right here. And that's much easier. What's more, if we just had a tiny bit of logic like this, return hello, and that's all the logic we did. It was just one line long. What we could do is, instead of this, do it all in one line without the curly braces. So it would look something like this. So we don't use the curly braces and we don't need the return keyword because it's implicitly returning that value now. So that's like a shorthand version of it. And so it becomes much easier to write this kind of thing than the old style of function. Again, there are other differences, but I don't want to dive into those because it will start to get a bit more complex. And this is enough for you to understand what we'll be doing throughout this course. So a lot of the time when we're creating projects, we'll be using data that's coming from an API somewhere or a database. Now, when we use that, normally we'd use something like Axios or the Fetch API to go and grab that data. I'm going to be using the Fetch API, and typically these tasks take some time to do. For example, if we're going out to get data, it might take a second or two to get that data and return it to us in our code. And so when we make those fetch requests, we don't instantly get access to the data as we make them. We have to wait a couple of seconds, and that's what promises are for. So I'm going to briefly talk about promises right now. So I'm going to use this thing called JSON placeholder, which is a dummy REST API, so we can make a request to an endpoint to get some data. So down here, you can see this is how we make the fetch request. We say fetch using the native fetch API, and then we pass in an endpoint. So I'm just going to copy this thing right here, okay? So inside index.js, I'm going to fetch this data. So this is an endpoint, which is going to grab us a to-do. Now, like I said, this takes some time to complete, so I can't just say something like this, const to-do is equal to this, because then it's just not going to assign the value of that to-do to to-do. Instead, this will be a promise. So I'll explain what that is in a second. Let me just log it to the console, to-do, like this, save it, and come over here and preview. And we can see this word, promise, and that means it's pending. And what a promise does is give us a placeholder value that will be fulfilled at some point in time. Basically what it's saying is, look, I promise to give you a value once I've finished this task, once I've got the data and returned it. So we have to wait for that promise to be fulfilled before we use the data. So how do we do that? Well, typically we don't store the promise in a constant like this. Instead, what we could do is tack on a method called then. So whenever an action like this returns a promise, like we just saw, we can use the then method and chain it onto that. And what this does is take in a callback function. And this callback function will fire when this is complete. So after the promise is resolved and we have the response back. And it takes in that response right here. And then we can do something with that response inside this function. Now, for example, I could just say here console.log the response object. So if I save this now and preview, we can see now we get the response object. If I refresh, then it's only a fraction of a second because the task is really quick to go out and grab that data, but it only outputs this once we have the response. Now, let me just demonstrate something. I'm going to log something to the console down here, and it's just going to be hello. Now, what's going to be logged out first, this or this? Well, you might think this because this is higher up in the code, but it's actually going to be this because we start this process, but then the code carries on while it's going on, even though it's only taking a fraction of a second, and it logs out this. Then, when this is complete and the promise is resolved, the function inside the then method fires, and then we log this to the console. So this will go first and then this. And this is what's called non-blocking code. It doesn't block the rest of the code from running because we don't have to wait for the response and this to fire before we carry on down the code. Let me save this and preview, and we can see hello comes first and then the response object. Now, if we take a look inside this response object, there's a lot of different things, a lot of different properties. But where's the data in itself? Well, in order to get the data when we're using the fetch API, we have to use a method on this response object, and that is called a JSON method. So we take the response object and say .json, and what this does is pass this response from JSON into a JavaScript object for us. And this in itself is asynchronous, and it takes some time to do, and so it returns a promise. And so what we can do, since this is returning a promise, therefore this return value will be a promise, is tack on another then method. And inside here, we can get the past data that this returns when the promise is fulfilled. And we take that into this callback function, like so. And now I could just console.log the data. So if I save this, oops, unexpected token, let's see what's going on. That's because I've not done my arrow correctly. Save that. And now we can see this is the data that we get back, and we can now use that inside our project. So we're going to see this kind of syntax quite frequently when we first start to use asynchronous code. We make a fetch request, it returns a promise, so we tack on a then method, we fire a function when that promise resolves, and inside there we get access to the response object. Now when we use the fetch method, that response object contains a method on it called JSON, which is used to pass the data. We invoke that, which is also asynchronous, and returns a promise. So we tack on another then. And then inside this, we fire a function which receives the data, the parsed data, and we can do something with it. This is the steps that we're going to take for a lot of the asynchronous code, especially earlier on in the course. So we've seen now how the fetch API returns a promise and then fires the function inside the then methods when the promise is resolved. But there's a newer way that we can handle promises, and that's with async and await, which are two key words. So I'm going to show you how to do this. Now, if we're going to use async and await, the first thing we need to do is create an asynchronous function which will contain all of the asynchronous code. So let's do that. I'm going to call this getToDo, and I'm going to set that equal to a function, and inside this function is where we're going to do our fetch request. So let's grab all that and paste it inside this function. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is make sure that this is an asynchronous function, and I do that by saying async, like so. So that's the first keyword. We need to put that in the function, or just as the function is created, in order to use await inside it. Okay, so now instead of doing these then methods right here, which only fire a function when this promise is resolved, instead of that we can just use the await keyword. So I could say await in front of this, and then we could assign the return value into a constant, which I'm going to call response. So we set it equal to this. So what does this do? Well, remember, this right here returns a promise, and until it resolves we don't have the data. And what this await keyword does is wait here until the promise is resolved, and then the data that we get back from that resolved promise is then assigned to this constant. So if I log this to the console, we should see the response object. If I save it, and oops, we need to invoke getToDo, like so, and save that. Okay, so getToDo is not defined. Let's spell this correctly, getToDo. Okay, so now we get this response object. So that works. Now remember, before, if we delete that await keyword, then this right here is just going to be a promise, because we're not waiting now for that promise to resolve and give us the data. But when we use await, we are waiting. We're waiting right here until it resolves in order for us to grab that response object. Now we can't place this inside a function unless the function is marked as async like this, so that's very important. Okay, so next what we could do is say const data is equal to await, and then the response object dot JSON, because remember, this is also asynchronous and it returns a promise. So we want to wait right here for that promise to resolve, and then the data from that promise we assign to this variable. So now we could console.log the data instead, save this, and we see the data right here. Okay, so this is async and await, and it does allow us to make our code a little more elegant and handle promises a bit better, and it's more readable as well. We don't have to chain on then after then. So probably in the second half of this course I will be using async and await quite a lot.